The facilitator for today will be Dale Melcher. Dale is on the retired committee, and she retired from UMass Amherst Labor Center. Go ahead, Dale.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, add my welcome to all of you. We're so glad you could join us for this talk. I will be curating the questions that you post in Q&A and keeping an eye on whether we should interrupt Bill and get that answered or whether we should wait till the end. And I'll also be monitoring your raised hands. It is my pleasure to introduce Bill. He's an attorney with the ACLU of Massachusetts, where he writes and records the Civil Liberties Minutes, which are these pithy little audio podcasts highlighting threats to civil liberties and what each of us can do to protect our civil liberties. The Civil Liberties Minutes are aired on radio stations across the country, and they're available on the ACLUM website, aclum.org, and wherever you get your podcasts. He's also co-host of a morning radio show, Monday through Friday, called Talk the Talk. It's available streaming or as a podcast on WHMP.com. He's a columnist for the Daily Hampshire Gazette, and he's the author of 2 books, When the War Came Home and Life on the Co-op Plan, both of which are collections of his essays and columns. We're delighted to have him speak today on what is clearly a hot topic, libraries and liberties, a look at the local and national efforts to remove books from library shelves, both public and school libraries. Thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I really have 3 points to make, so let me make them at the beginning. First, the situation in Massachusetts with regard to book banning is serious, and it's something that we should and need to be concerned about. The second point is, it's not as bad in Massachusetts as it is many places in the country, and many states are in far dire situation with regard to the potential and the reality of book banning. And the third point is that with regard to Massachusetts, there is something we all can do and can do now, this week, today, after this meeting is over, to actually ameliorate the threats to liberty, to freedom of expression, to the freedom to learn, the freedom of kids to see and to access books that they should have the right to see and to read. The threats to this precious right really come from three places, 3 sources: state legislators, school boards, and organized right-wing groups that are demanding censorship as a means to further their religious and/or political and social agendas. Dale mentioned Civil Liberties Minute. I'd like to, these are weekly. I'd like to play one because I have done a number of them recently on this topic, and I think it will set up what we are going to talk about this afternoon. Dale, could you play one of these book banning Civil Liberties Minutes, please?
Sure.
Had set an all-time high. Years ago, a local parent or a community member might demand book banning is at an all-time high.
Listen up. This matters. I'm Lewis Black, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute with ACLU attorney Bill Newman.
The highest since the ALA, that's the American Library Association, began tracking this data 20 years ago. Twice as many bans in 2022 as in 2021, a year that itself had set an all-time high. Years ago, a local parent or a community member might demand that a book be taken off the shelf. Now, there are demands for multiple removals, sometimes hundreds of books at a time, demands often made by organized groups, many national, that have a political or a social agenda. A few books have been challenged because they have racist language, but the vast majority of the books being targeted have LGBTQ themes. These groups don't want people to read these books. The director of the Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom is quoted in the recent AP story as saying that the last 2 years, quote, have been exhausting, frightening, and outrage-inducing. And the story is getting worse. Bills that do or may facilitate the restriction of books in public libraries and or schools have passed and or are pending in many states, including Iowa, Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Florida, among others. Apparently, the 21st century crusade of book banning has only just begun. That's a fearful prospect, which speaks volumes.
The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the American Civil Liberties Union because freedom can't defend itself.
Here's some more information with regard to the big picture, the national picture. In 2022, 2,571 unique titles in libraries across the country were targeted to be removed. That's an almost 40% increase from the previous year. Of those titles, the vast majority were written by or are about the LGBTQIA+ community, or by and about Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. The challenges to the books between public libraries and school libraries, actually they divide up pretty closely, almost 50-50, 51% to books in school libraries, 49% targeted in public libraries. Of significance, both politically and practically, 90% of the reported book challenges were demands to censor multiple titles. And of those demands to censor library books, 40% sought to remove or restrict over 100 books at a time. This is a sea change. As I noted in the Civil Liberties Minute you just heard, prior to 2020, the vast majority of challenges to library books were brought by a single parent who sought to remove or restrict, or guardian, sought to restrict access to a book that their child was reading. In 2022, legislators and elected officials in 12 states initiated legislation to amend state criminal obscenity laws. We're going to talk more about that in just a minute, to permit criminal prosecution of librarians and educators for distributing material claimed to be illegal and or inappropriate for minors. These bills have passed in many states. They are being challenged one by one. The 2022 books include those that were being challenged: Gender Queer by Maya Kobabe, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, and This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. Now, Massachusetts data with regard to book censorship is actually rather thin. We don't have a lot of data, probably because in years gone by, there weren't that many attempts. We do know that in 2022, there were 45 attempts to remove books in libraries, in schools, and public libraries across Massachusetts. Now, we're going to talk about what is the legal basis for those challenges in just a minute. I would like to emphasize that it's not just the challenges themselves that are problematic. It is the chilling effect that those challenges have on teachers and students and librarians in a given school or a given community. So it's not just what happens in a court or in a school committee hearing. It is the fact that books are being challenged and that they are being removed sometimes that has a ripple effect that is pernicious and difficult and needs to stop. Now, one advantage that Massachusetts has over other states is we don't have a specific law that promotes book banning. But that doesn't mean that Massachusetts school communities and libraries across the Commonwealth can't have their free speech rights chilled. And in this regard, I'd like to review with you what recently happened in Berkshire County, which I think gives us a disturbing object lesson. This was December. This just happened. At the D. Du Bois Regional Middle School in Great Barrington, there was a complaint lodged, and the police report does not indicate who the complainant was. But a complaint was lodged which described a book as containing pornography. The book, as reported in the Berkshire Eagle, was genderqueer. Genderqueer by Maya Kubabi is a memoir of Kubabi's coming of age and discovering that they are non-binary. Genderqueer has been one of the primary targets of Moms for Liberty. That's one of those groups that has a nationwide presence and is devoted to censorship and banning of books. This book, Genderqueer, is one of the most targeted books across the country and one of the targets of the group that calls itself Moms for Liberty. So, in response to this complaint in Great Barrington, a police officer was dispatched to the school. He was, at least did not arrive with a light on or in uniform. He was in plain clothes. He came in an unmarked cruiser, and he went to a teacher's classroom. He questioned the teacher. He looked for the book, and he intimated that a criminal complaint investigation had been opened by the district attorney's office. Just pause there for a minute to imagine how that must have felt to that teacher. The body cam footage shows the police officer in an 8th grade classroom asking to see a copy of Genderqueer and informing the teacher and the school principal who was there that although he doesn't want to, he says he could go through every room in the school to find it and ask every teacher. All this, even though I believe and firmly suggest that no crime was committed and therefore no investigation was warranted. I want to take you for a couple-minute walk in the weeds on the legal question of pornography and obscenity and harmful to children statutes. A quick definition. Pornography is sexually explicit, usually sexually explicit material. That's what we're talking about. Porn is, generally speaking, protected by the First Amendment, which doesn't mean you can see it, watch it, and do it whatever you want every place, but it has First Amendment protection. Obscenity does not. There's a world of difference in the law between pornography and obscenity. Pornography, again, sexual material or sexually explicit material. Obscenity, well, you'll probably recall the famous definition by the late Justice Potter Stewart, who said, I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it, which is not all that helpful. Wasn't that helpful when Potter Stewart was living, and really not helpful now. So the legislature has done its best to define what is meant by pornography, which is, generally speaking, the really gross stuff. When it comes to obscenity and pornography in Massachusetts, I think it is important to note two things. First, how the law defines pornography, which it doesn't really, but defines obscenity. So here's the definition in Massachusetts of obscenity, which is relevant to understanding what the statute says about harmful to kids material. Obscenity is material taken as a whole that appeals to the prurient interest of the average person using local standards and depicts or describes sexual conduct in a patently offensive way and, importantly, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, the so-called SLAPS definition. Serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. Now, harmful to minors. The Massachusetts law defines material harmful to minors, that is material that is obscenity, or material, if taken as a whole, describes or represents nudity, sexual conduct, or sexual excitement so as to appeal predominantly to the prurient interest of minors, or is patently contrary to prevailing standards of adults in the local community, in the county where the material was being distributed or shown, and again, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for minors. Now, the law has another piece of this that is worth noting, which is that, and with regard to genderqueer, I think is specifically worth noting, which is that if the police had bothered to take a quick, say maybe 30-second look to Google the book, it would have found that this book is award-winning and is valued throughout the country for what it teaches and what it says. And in addition to it not being obscene, in addition to it having great literary and educational value, there is an absolute defense in Massachusetts when material claimed to be such is part of a school or library employment activity. And by the way, the book wasn't in the classroom at all. But that aside, even if it had been, it couldn't be a crime because the Massachusetts statute says, in essence, schools, you deal with this issue. The criminal law is the wrong place to be. So the police visited. This went, of course, viral on social media. As a result, there was a walkout and demonstration by the LGBTQIA+ students and their allies at Monument Valley Regional High School. There was a strongly worded statement by Governor Maura Healey, which was characterized by the Berkshire Eagle, which is the local newspaper, as decrying book banning. There was a letter of apology that came out from the school superintendent and school committee chairperson expressing regret how the situation was handled. The district attorney then got around to indicating that no crime was committed, so there wouldn't be an investigation. And the school has announced that it's going to have meetings to review the situation, including as early as next week. So all's well that ends well, or at least not so badly. Well, not really. On one hand, the police chief has apologized to anyone who was adversely affected. But the issue remains, what about the chilling effect on the school? What about the chilling effect on the students, on the teachers, on the librarians? And will this deter further complaints in other school systems, or will it embolden them? Of particular concern, I think, is that although this was in some ways an isolated incident, it is as an example of censorship not singular in Massachusetts. Many of you may recall the Ludlow School Committee last year proposed a policy that set extremely vague, overbroad, and repressive standards for what material can and cannot be in school libraries, and included in that proposal provision, and I'm quoting, any district employee who fails to follow the policy, which is really hard to understand, you couldn't possibly know what really was or wasn't prohibited until after the fact. Any district employee who fails to follow the policy may be subject to discipline up to and including termination. The worst part of the proposal, or one of the worst parts of the proposals in Ludlow, is that it was proposed as a substitute for an existing policy that allowed parents to challenge books one at a time. Fortunately, that proposal did not pass. I want to talk today, my real hope today is that I inspire you to take action with regard to a proposal in the Massachusetts legislature that is coming up for a hearing before the Joint Committee on Education next Wednesday. My hope is that you will feel that you should ask your elected representatives, and your senator to not only endorse the bill, but to co-sponsor the bill. In order to understand what the bill does, I think it's important to understand a bit more about how challenges to books actually work in the country, throughout the country, in Massachusetts, and why this bill would go a long way to defeating censorship and book banning. In order to do that, we need to look at a case from the United States Supreme Court from 1982. And the case is PICO. And what happens in PICO, it's a school district in Long Island. Here's the synopsis, the blurb right at the beginning of Supreme Court cases, written by the reporter of decisions, not officially part of the case, but everyone reads it. The petitioner Board of Education, rejecting recommendations of the Committee of Parents and School Staff that it had appointed, ordered that certain books, which the board characterized as anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy, be removed from the high school and junior high school libraries. It was a fractured opinion, a plurality opinion of 3 justices, 4th joining it, a 5th deciding it for the school committee, which won below on procedural grounds, and 4 justices with a series of dissents. Among the books at issue in PICO, The Fixer, Black Boy by Richard Wright, Best Short Stories of Negro Writers, edited by Langston Hughes, The Naked Ape by Desmond Morse, Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. Now, as I said, it's a fractured opinion. And if you Google PICO, what you'll find is PICO still good law? Does PICO have any vitality? And the answer to that is, in some ways, oddly, it does. People still cite it and rely on its analysis in many of these arguments across the country about book banning. There's also, of course, citation to the dissent, which were written by Chief Justice Berger, Justices Powell, Rehnquist, and O'Connor. What PICO does in the plurality opinion, and what the judgment does for the 5 justices, is it says that there is an exception to the rule that local school authorities have virtual carte blanche to make decisions about what should be in the library. The exception is for removal of books, which the court, at least the plurality opinion says, is different from the decision to include books. Here's what the court said at the beginning of the case. In sum, the issue before us is a narrow one. It may best be restated as this, leaving aside the procedural question. Does the First Amendment impose any limitations upon the discretion of a school system to remove library books from the school library? And the plurality says there are limits on that discretion. Having said that, there's this kind of Harry Truman-esque statement about what I want for my cabinet is a one-handed economist. He said, I'm so tired of economists because all they do is tell me on one hand there's this, on the other hand there's that. And the Supreme Court did that in PICO, but listen to how they come out. First, I'm going to read you a very short statement about what the underlying rationale is, and then the exception. This court has long recognized that local school boards have broad discretion in the management of school affairs, and by and large, public education in our nation is committed to the control of state and local authorities, and that federal courts should not ordinarily intervene. We have repeatedly emphasized the comprehensive authority of schools and of school officials to prescribe and control conduct in the schools. And then goes on to say, at the same time, we have necessarily recognized the discretion of the states and local school boards in matters of education must be exercised in a manner that comports with the transcendent imperatives of the First Amendment. So the school board, the court in Pico rejects the school board's decision to remove these books and says you have to look at motivation in removing books. Why is the school doing this? And if the objective is censorship, that is prohibited by the First Amendment. Again, not a majority opinion, but again, often cited. Here's the final word from the court in Pico. Nothing in our decision affects in any way the discretion of a local board to choose to add to the libraries of their schools. Nothing in our decision today in any way affects the discretion of a local school board to choose books to add to the libraries of the schools. Because we are concerned with the suppression of ideas, our holding today affects only the discretion to remove books. So, that conclusion is important, but Pico itself is a rather weak read on which to rely on as a defense for the removal of books. And in Massachusetts, we are lucky because we have a state constitutional provision, it's Article 16 of the state constitution, which provides broader freedom of speech protection than the First Amendment does under the federal constitution. How much broader and in what circumstances, that remains undecided. But we do have more state protection for freedom of speech, freedom of expression than the federal constitution provides. So let's go back to the bill that is pending, that you can become involved in, that you can help to progress in its journey, we hope, through the state legislature. It's Senate Bill 2528. It's House Bill 4229. The Senate Bill S 2528 was sponsored initially by Senator Julian Cyr from Cape Cod and the islands. It has been joined in an identical bill introduced by Representative John Moran of Boston, the 9th Suffolk District. There is a hearing, as I mentioned, on the Joint Committee on Education next Wednesday. For those who are not familiar with this terminology, the House of Representatives of Massachusetts has its committee, the Senate has its committees, and there are some joint committees, and there is a joint committee on education. One other point. In the Massachusetts protocols, well, I don't know about protocols, but in Massachusetts, it is unusual for a bill, not unheard of, but unusual for a bill to pass the first time it is introduced into the legislature. This is this bill's first journey through the legislative process. It can pass, but it is not a foregone conclusion by any stretch that it will. So, Senator Cyer's bill, and I call it Senator Cyer's bill because he introduced it early and the House bill was introduced relatively late. It's posted in the chat, I believe, and there's a link to it, and it's only 2 or 2.5 pages. And a lot of the space is filled up by the definition of librarian. And as this group knows more and better than others, many schools in Massachusetts do not have librarians, but there are teachers who function essentially as a librarian. And just filling all those words in takes a lot of the space on those 2 or 2.5 pages of this bill. So here's what the bill does. First, it addresses what materials and who decides will go on a library shelf. And it says the librarian, and I'm using that for all the persons who act as librarians as well as the librarian themselves. The librarian, based on their professional training and not on political or personal views, decides what goes on the shelf. Now, how can that determination be overruled? It says this. Such a determination shall not be overruled except upon a judgment issued by a vote of the school committee after notice in public hearing and recommendation by a review committee of school personnel and the superintendent, and that based on, listen to this, this really matters, and that based on clear and convincing evidence, the material is devoid of any educational, literary, artistic, or social value, or is not age appropriate for any children who attend the school. I hope we've had enough of a discussion to have a sense of what we mean by devoid of educational, literary, artistic, or social value, and not age appropriate. Pay attention to the standard, clear and convincing evidence. In our system of justice, we have three standards. We have the preponderance of the evidence, that's a general civil standard, 50% plus a feather. We have beyond a reasonable doubt, which means beyond a reasonable doubt. And the standard in between, but much closer to beyond a reasonable doubt, is clear and convincing evidence. It is a very high standard of proof, as it should be, if there's going to be a book banning in a school. Now, the question becomes, based, I think, on all of our reading of what is happening in other states, who gets to challenge a decision made by this committee to remove a book, which is obviously has to be based on has to be not only proven to clear and convincing evidence, but has to be based on objective evidence. It has to be clear and convincing evidence that it is devoid of educational value. So, who gets to challenge a decision if that committee should decide to remove a book? And the statute says a student, a parent, or guardian, and as grounds that the decision was not supported by clear and convincing evidence. Now, one of the really important issues that has come up in these book banning challenges across the country is what happens to the book while it's being challenged. And this statute will provide, or the proposal provides, it will stay on the shelf pending the decision of the school committee. And again, I note that the committee's decision has to be based on objective evidence, not on feelings. So that is the proposal that will go before the Joint Committee on Education next week. It is the proposal that I hope will pass. I'd like to conclude, if we might, Dale, if we could play one more Civil Liberties Minute, because I think it does summarize in part what some of these challenges are and what they are apt to be.
So Bill, the September 26th one?
This is the one. This is the one. It's not the book Returns Home, which I would like to save for the Q&A.
Okay, here we go.
Get your banned books here. Get your banned books.
Listen up. This matters. I'm Louis Black, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute with ACLU attorney Bill Newman.
In the small western Massachusetts city of Northampton, of the 21,000 books donated to the September 2023 League of Women Voters book sale, more than 1,000 titles shared, as the local newspaper put it, quote, the distinction of at some point having been banned or challenged in libraries and school districts across America. Books like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Hunger Games, A Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises, Charlotte's Web, Where's Waldo, and the Harry Potter series, which may strike you as just plain goofy. But sadly, there's nothing funny here. Censorship across this country is deadly serious. The Florida Department of Education has announced the recent removal of over 300 titles, and Texas school districts have banned more than 800 books. Books that deal with gender identity, LGBTQ themes, and race are the ones most targeted by censors. To bring its display of banned books up to date, the League of Women Voters purchased the recently targeted Maya Kababi's Genderqueer and George M. Johnson's All Boys Aren't Blue. One irony here, the book sale raises money for the League of Women Voters and its work protecting the right to vote, another fundamental right under attack in the United States right now.
The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the American Civil Liberties Union because freedom can't defend itself.
So perhaps we could
Now to go.
Perhaps we could leave it there as I get to interrupt myself, I guess. and see if there are some questions or comments that you would like to ask or make.
Well, I have a couple of questions that were posed while you were talking. One question was, what Massachusetts towns saw attempted bans in the past year or so?
Yeah, I don't know, have a list. I'm really hesitant to start answering that off the top of my top of my head. I'm sorry, it would be a good question. It's a good question. It's a valid question. I can't give you a complete list.
And then there was another question about, did you say that there were 3 different places that the threat came from? And if you did, what could you repeat those? And then I have a note here from Sue Doherty in the chat saying that Abington had a huge challenge. Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, there have been a number of them. I'm going to leave it there. The three centers of protest against books and in favor of book banning. There's state legislation, which is very dangerous. There are national groups that are targeting books and communities. And there are, of course, our local school boards that can issue their own regulations, as what happened, what was attempted to be done in Ludlow, which can not only end up with book banning, but have an enormous chilling effect.
I have a question here from Susan Moynihan. Susan, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, thanks. I'll turn my video on too. It's not as much of a question as just a comment. I'm a retired school librarian, and you mentioned, by the way, Bill, thanks for your talk, that oftentimes teachers serve as librarians in schools. And actually, for schools that don't have librarians, I don't think it's usually a teacher that serves. It's often a paraprofessional.
You're right.
even-
I may have misspoken. I mean, I'm familiar with teachers who've done that, but there is a person designated in the schools, as I understand it, to act as a librarian, where there is none. Yes.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's a person who might even be a volunteer or a person who is not trained as a librarian. So which makes a challenge even more difficult if that's. But the other question I have is there's also the question of classroom libraries. Teachers have many teachers have extensive classroom libraries, and I think that school libraries often should have policies in place if there is a challenge, but I don't think classroom teachers ever selection and challenge policies are common for libraries, but not for classrooms, I think.
Yes, although what happened, of course, in the situation in the Berkshires was a challenge. I don't know if the teacher would have called it a library, but she had books in her classroom.
Yes, it was a classroom library, yeah.
And when it was demanded, where's the book? She said, I don't know. Some teacher may have borrowed it. Some student may have, I don't know. You know, they're books. People take them out. What do you want me to do? But I think your point is really well taken. And I think the statute as proposed will give a lot of protection because it takes that responsibility from the individual who is responsible for deciding books, yes or no, and gives it to a professional committee with professional standards and a high standard of proof.
Sue Doherty, I saw that you had a comment. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, just to follow up from Susan. So without having librarians, it is a huge issue, but like one thing, and I haven't read the legislation yet, but you know, I was in Needham, that's where I just retired from. I was also in Brockton, but if districts and schools don't have really good challenge policies, that makes it harder too. So like in Needham, they were only allowed, we had a really strong policy, and if a parent or anyone wanted to challenge a book, they could only challenge one at a time. And they had to fill a form out and they had to have read it. And so by having really strong policies in place, it can prevent, what happened in Abington where people just stood up at the mic and, insisted a book be taken off the shelf, and it went on for like a year. So we've had, we've had quite a few in the state, but I just put a link in there that a survey that the Mass Library Board of Commissioners put together about challenges and bans for anyone who might be interested. I put that in the chat. So anyway, thank you. I just want to make that comment.
No, I think that's really important, and I would note that this proposed legislation is not the ceiling, it's the floor. School committees, local school committees are perfectly entitled, with this bill having passed, if and when it does, to enact more stringent rules for how books could be removed, obviously consistent with the state law, if and when it passes.
I have a question here from Martha London. Martha, I don't know whether you want to speak to it yourself. The question was, are there political topics other than sexuality and race that are a threat of being banned?
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering if there is other stuff like anti-American or any kind of leftist political stuff or rightist political stuff or anything like that. I understand it seems like LGBTQ stuff is, and race is most dangerous, but do you see any trend going that way?
Well, I think that the data, as I understand it, shows overwhelmingly that the books being challenged are LGBTQIA plus themes, race, gender, and I suspect that a lot, they come in and they say, here are 100 books, we haven't read them, they're all being challenged. And Texas says, okay, you're right, that's bad stuff in them, and so we'll ban them. And I don't mean to be facetious, but it's not that rigorous. And I do think that there's a lot of overlap between politics and race and gender and trans issues. And so I can't give you a specific number, but I do think that overwhelmingly what you've identified and what we talked about here today are the issues that engender those kinds of challenges and proposals to ban books.
And that's in both school libraries and public libraries?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Bird, you had a question about the bill?
Yeah, my question was, who do we expect is going to be opposing the bill? Are any of these national groups coming into the state, or is it more locally based? What do we expect?
I don't know that, I can't predict that. I don't know if any national groups will show up to oppose the bill. There are a number of co-sponsors of the bill, including out here, Senator Joe Comerford. There are 6 or 8 or 10 co-sponsors in the House and the Senate bill. I think, again, if the more co-sponsors, the greater the possibility of it being seriously considered. It's in Massachusetts, there is a procedure that a bill goes to a committee hearing, and the committee then can do one of 3 things. It can recommend that the bill proceed to a floor vote, either as proposed or as amended by the committee. It could recommend that the bill not go forward, which means it's dead. Or it could recommend that it go for further study, which is legislative purgatory. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to be studied, but it's not exactly rejected. And the bigger threat to this bill, I would suggest, I don't know this with any inside knowledge, is not that it won't, is that it will be committed for further study, which means it's dead for this session. So would outside groups get involved? It wouldn't surprise me. But maybe they would view the Massachusetts legislature as unfriendly territory. But, again, we've had these threats to books and these proposals for books banning here. So no surprise if there are people showing up to to oppose the bill in its particulars, including, who has the burden of proof and what the evidence should be.
So I'd be curious to hear from retired teachers about whether they've had any experience with either formal challenges to books that they want to use or that other teachers want to use, or if they felt more informal pressure about using or not using certain books. Sue Doherty?
Yeah.
You can just use the hand raising
Oh,
function.
sorry. So I did just retire, but I've been a school librarian since 2004, and I've seen it like increase like so much. And every year I used to do with the 8th grade students, I used to do like the band, the banned books list, banned books week. And I saw the trend about 10 years ago where it was maybe 5 years ago, where it's starting to be more LGBTQ and people of color. And you could just see it every year in the top 10. But it makes you really question when you order books. Like I started to get more nervous about my book orders. And the book, this book is gay. Actually, we rely on recommendations because we can't always read every single book before we order them. And that book is recommended for like grades 8 up in some places, age 12 up in other places, grades 9 up. It's all over the place. And I was about to order it, and then I heard about what was happening in Abington, and I actually had already ordered it. So I sent it to the high school. I said, I'm not taking a chance of putting it on my shelf. And like the other book, that the police came for, genderqueer, I actually read that. I didn't order it from my library because it was recommended for high school more so. So also part of that's part of having the trained librarian, is that we know we know how to look in the reviews and determine whether it's appropriate for our grade level. And that helps keep the school out of trouble too, because maybe that book shouldn't have been in a middle school. And I'm not about censorship. I'm just like, again, looking at professional reviews. So but it does have a chilling effect. And then the last thing is Twitter. There's a woman called Libs of TikTok. She actually found a book. I retired this year, but she found a book in my school library catalog that I had ordered, which was totally reviews, fine for middle school. And she went after the principal, and they were people from all these right-wing people from TikTok threatening the principal, found her address. She had to leave TikTok. It hasn't been publicized, but that's something that, she wants to keep quiet. And I'm just telling you guys this in this group, because it's also coming from like, these kind of right-wing, they like bloodthirsty sharks, right? So it becomes very personal and can be dangerous. So those are some examples I've seen.
I mean, I can jump in here too as a retired school librarian. I was a K-5, JK to 5 librarian. So the only book that I was ever challenged on was a book called Tell Me About Sex, Grandma. And but the mother, it was one mother who was very upset that this book was in the school library, and she never challenged it formally. She just talked to me about it and then decided not to go through the process. But it was I did end up putting it in the section of the library, the teacher section, because I thought it might be a good book to read with a child, not for yeah, but it was probably because that mother had challenged me so strongly about it. But I mean, I didn't remove it from the library. But yeah, it's true, it does have an effect on you. I also got a lot of pressure. There's pressure from a variety. I got a lot of pressure to remove my Dr. Seuss books, and that was for completely different reasons. There's a lot of controversy about Dr. Seuss, and I did not. There's several Dr. Seuss books that I removed, but I did keep the Lorax, and but once again, there was never any kind of formal challenge. A lot of it is sort of comments and behind, an attempt to shame me for collection decisions that I made. So I'll stop there.
Bill, can you say something more about the difference between individual parents or maybe a group of parents complaining about a specific book, and this national effort to just remove the list of 400 books from library shelves, whether they're actually in those libraries or not?
Well, I think that, again, let's back up. I think a lot of this depends on what the local school system has as a process, if there is a process. And I think that various school systems throughout the country are targeted, either because they are vulnerable and or because there is a local person who has a complaint who has accessed them. So I think it's difficult to generalize, but the national groups have lists of books and they will make them available to colleagues and persons of like mind who want to challenge them in their local school systems. And I don't think there's a way to stop that, but there is a way to have a system that doesn't accommodate it. So this statute and local statutes, but again, when there's a fight locally, it could end up with people, as in Ludlow, saying, let's have more restrictive policies, which is why we want a state law that sets the minimum. And it's not a low bar minimum, it's a high bar minimum.
Thank you. Ferd, you have your hand up?
You're muted first.
Yeah, so we're all part of the MTA, so I'm wondering whether the MTA has taken a position on this bill, is actively working on it. Are there things we can do besides contact our individual legislators, but get the union as a whole involved?
Well, far be it from me to tell my friend Max Page what he should or shouldn't be doing. But I don't know that the MTA, I understand that at the hearing on Wednesday, the ACLU will test the ACLU of Massachusetts legislative staff will testify. I'm told that allies will testify, and I just don't know if that includes the MTA or not.
Andre, do you have any information?
I don't. I mean, there are hundreds of bills that come up, and the governance division in MTA makes a list of priorities of what we're going to pay attention to and actively lobby for. But the issues here seem entirely consistent with standing resolutions of the MTA. So I don't think that there would be any problem in having either Patrick as the head of our committee, right, or the other people that have been involved in organizing this particular event, contacting the GR division of MTA and Max and Deb, and encouraging that our organization go on the record as supporting these bills.
Great. Patrick, you had your hand up?
I'm just curious. I mean, we've been talking about on one end of the spectrum in terms of the banning process, but what about the other end of the spectrum, where books that are considered to be like I'm thinking specifically of like Mark Twain, or Mark Twain essentially gets, is that present within this around this issue?
There have been some challenges from the left, but overwhelmingly they are from the right. And again, if there were a challenge to Mark Twain with this legislation, I can't imagine how it would be removed, given its serious literary, artistic, political, social, educational value. So this book, this proposal that is designed to make book banning difficult, I think will protect books regardless of their ideology or the manner of expression.
Susan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was just thinking about this whole issue. There's a political movement to remove books from the right wing, but then there's also a lot of pressure to remove to not teach books, like some Mark Twain books because of the use of the N-word, for example. And I've seen teachers literally throw books in the trash. Like there's a children's book called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is, has won like a dozen different awards, including the Coretta Scott King Award. It's a story of a Black family in the South during Jim Crow. I've seen teachers literally throw that book away because it contains the N-word. So there's self-censorship. There's a great deal of self-censorship that does happen. So there might not be formal challenges. I've also seen people literally throw out Little House on the Prairie and Little House because of the way, Laura Ingalls Wilder, there's many racist things that are said in the book. And, from my perspective, those are opportunities for conversation, because books can be troubling and books can be difficult and books can make you feel bad. And that's why you discuss it and you talk about it and you look at the author's perspective. But I do think that this is a different issue because nobody's demanding that they be removed, but they are quietly being removed. So, because books are powerful things, and people who disagree with a certain title don't want other people to read it and agree with it. So, and which I think is the wrong direction to go.
I want to thank Nancy Costa. She put a comment in the chat or in the questions that said that she also had a few conversations about challenged books, but no formal challenges in her years, 2007, 2013. And it seems to her that the challenges are of late. Annette, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I always think of things as teachable moments. And I've been thinking as we've been talking about what a conundrum this is. And that if we think about how, as educators, we can reach out to parents in a way that educates them as to the process, as to what education is, as to the fact that we have these books for a reason. And that's to teach children to form their own opinions, to give them the broadest information so that they themselves can make the decisions. And I'm wondering about the challenge when we say we threw out the book because of the N-word or because of Little House on the Prairie and all this stuff. Those are all, we're people are throwing them up because it's politically correct, which is to me political suicide. It's like it hampers us. And I'm wondering how we throw out these books because they're politically incorrect, but we are stifling intellectual integrity and learning about history and putting things in place so that we can understand how that fits in our society and how we want to treat each other. And it's such a conundrum. It just feels like either way, you're on a tightrope here. That's just a comment off the cuff.
Thank you. Sue, you have your hand up?
I want to just follow up on something Nancy said, but before I do, I just want to say about about books like Little House on the Prairie. There's been a movement in the last few years in libraries and to make the collection, because there are harmful stereotypes and some of the language people used to use years ago, you don't really want the kids reading that. I actually reread Peter Pan last year, a couple of years ago. I couldn't believe how racist it was. And I read that as a kid. I don't really think we necessarily need to put that in front of kids. Like there are some books that maybe their time is gone, right? So, or maybe the harmful, offensive stereotypes we see now, people didn't see at the time. So that's a whole different conversation. But so I think that's more about selection and about deselection. It's not necessarily about banning a book. It's more about like deciding, is this appropriate for this time period? Are my students going to feel bad by reading a book like this? So those are more those kind of questions. But Nancy used to be my boss, so I just wanted to I wanted to give an example of how what Nancy did that was a really good thing. We had a student when I was working with her in Brockton, and he came to us and he said, "Hey, you don't have any books on atheism." And so we looked into it, and we actually didn't. So this is about building the collection, but also listening to the patrons. And we realized we didn't have any books. We had a book on the Quran, we had some Bibles, but we didn't have any Jewish texts, and we didn't have any books on atheism. So what we did was we ordered some books to like balance the collection so that all the voices are there. But so that was kind of a mild challenge, but that was more about what we didn't have. But again, you want to make sure everyone's represented. That's all. And Nancy was good. She made a good decision. I like the way she handled that. So I just want to give her a shout out.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions for Bill or each other on this topic? Patrick.
Yeah, you raise you raise an interesting issue in terms of a book may be inappropriate at a certain age, but later on, reflecting on the way in which the book influences our culture, I think is very important. And it still needs to be part of, for the lack of a better word, the tradition in terms of understanding. I mean, Mark Twain is a case in point. You're not going to read that, I think I read Mark Twain maybe in 7th grade or something like that when I went to school. I'm not sure that would be, in high school, I think that would be good to basically talk about the issue of racism within the culture, and here is a text, but also to look at the nuance within Mark Twain, that in fact there is a positive element within his image of blacks, which often is lost sight of. But if you just take it at a simple level, no, it's not. I taught psychology. We would show films. I never really had any pushback, but you end up at the high school level, you can do things that you can't do at the middle and elementary school. And this really points to the importance of teachers having a say in their professional development. Standardized testing basically wants to strip all this stuff out, but we are the ones who know how to basically frame the issues in such a way that there can be a kind of nuanced discussion around these issues.
First of all, I want to thank you all. I thought this was really interesting. You were a fabulous group to talk to. I hope it was of some interest, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to all of you. I have one last Civil Liberties Minute, which is really about a library book that I thought before we go, I'd like to share, because it does have an optimistic take on all of this.
I'm Bill Newman, and this is the Civil Liberties Minute. The book's author was James Clerk Maxwell, not exactly a household name. And the book, titled An Elementary Treatise on Electricity, well, never exactly topped a bestseller list. Not surprising, since the book is, as the New York Times story put it, crammed with technical jargon and mathematical equations. The book was published in 1881, and the New Bedford, Massachusetts Public Library acquired a copy in 1882. So far, so good. But after being checked out in 1905, it wasn't returned. Fast forward 118 years to May 2023, when the Massachusetts Library received a note from the rare books curator at the West Virginia University Library that read, "We have recently received a donation that included a book from your library. Would you like it returned?" The answer was yes, and it was. And yes, we were concerned about late fees too. They were a penny a day in 1905 when the book was checked out, so they could have been over $400. Fortunately, decades ago, late fees were capped at $2. This is indeed a feel-good story. What we can feel even better about is a 2023 news story about a library that, for a change, isn't about censors trying to pull a book off the shelf, but rather about a book going home. The Civil Liberties Minute is made possible by the ACLU, because freedom can't protect itself.